Good day, everyone. Community Associations Institute is pleased to welcome you to today's webinar entitled Shock to the System Part 2, Practical Considerations for EV Chargers. Our speakers today are Will Washington, Sammy Satori, and Jimmy Suissa. My name is Alden Michaels, and I will be your moderator for today. The session will last 60 minutes and include question and answer sessions at the end. You can submit a question at any time by typing into the chat, or you can use the Q&A feature that is there. If you don't see that, don't worry, just type it right into the chat. You can respond and collaborate with your peers throughout the program in the chat window. Please note that your name will be displayed along with any comments that you make during the webinar. Upon completion of this webinar, be sure to complete the webinar evaluation with your feedback on today's program. The recording of the session will be available to all registrants within 48 hours of today's program. Lastly, all webinar participants will also receive a certificate of attendance at the conclusion of the program. The certificate will be accessible anytime on CAI's website. You just go under My Classes and Events. Now, if you enjoy this webinar, you may enjoy next month's webinar on electronic voting presented by Kathy Slight on August 23rd at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. If you look out for the registration for that, it will be opening soon. We do have a best practice report on community association maintenance through the Foundation for Community Association Research. That and several other wonderful bits of information, research, and materials are available to you. So we'd love to see you use those. So on CAI's website or the Foundation for Community Association Research's website has this and many other things. We do have a large-scale managers workshop coming up in Hawaii on October 4th through 7th, 2023. And we'd love to see you there as well. And we do have some upcoming PMDP courses coming up, the M100s coming up just next week. And then we have the M202 and the M310 coming up later on in August. These are all live and instruction delivered over Zoom. And finally, we'd like to thank our webinar sponsor, Avid Exchange. All right, we're going to move along to the main presentation here with Will Washington, Sammy Satori, and Jimmy Suissa. And I figured you might want to know a little bit more about our speakers. So let's introduce them. Will Washington. Will Washington is a graduate of Duke University and Vanderbilt Law School of Law. He's a shareholder with Chadwick, Washington, Moriarty, Elmore, and Bunn. He's author of numerous articles on legal issues concerning community associations and a frequent and, if I may say, wonderful speaker on the topics. Winner of the Don Buck Lifetime Achievement Contribution Award, the CAI President's Award, and the WMCCAI's President's Award. And has served on as a member of CAI Board of Trustees, president of the WMCCAI, commissioner on the Community Association Manager International Certification Board, and chair of CAI's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Task Force. That's a mouthful, Will, but it's also just wonderful to have you here. All right, and we have Sammy Satori. Sammy holds an engineering degree and a master's degree in financial planning from the College for Financial Planning. Also holds a registered health underwriter and chartered health consultant designations. Sam is the president of Quest Insurance with over 30 years of experience as a proven leader in risk management, a CAA educated business partner, member of the Chesapeake Regional and Washington Metro chapters where he is active on education and newsletter committees. Currently serves on the board of directors for the Property Management Association, Quest, and is just all around just been the powerhouse of this and so many other. He and Will have been so wonderful in working so hard on this. We're so glad to have you here, Sammy. Welcome.
Thank you.
And finally, Jimmy Suissa. Jimmy is a real estate services management PQ controlling entity, a master association in Northwest DC serving the Clara Barton Condo Association, the Lafayette Condo Association, and several others. He's the overseeing the master association and entails all aspects of managing a large complex, including large and small scale projects, managing the finances and investments, such as a current solar project. He also has a master's in business administration from Johns Hopkins University, holds CMCA and AMS credentials, and is working toward his PCAM. Welcome, Jimmy.
Thank you.
All right. And with that, we are going to go ahead and get started with a poll. We have some poll questions for you. First one here, nice and easy. What's your role at your community? Are you a community manager? Are you a board member or an owner? Are you an attorney? Are you a business partner? And secondly, do you currently have any electric vehicles in your community? Do you have solar panels? Do you have a charging station? Or you don't have any of them, but you never know, they might show up. We're getting answers flying in. Thank you for answering so quickly. We're going to hold for just a few more seconds here. right, I think we're going to go ahead and close this. If you weren't able to vote or you couldn't figure out how to vote, that is okay. Zoom is different on several different platforms. Looks like we're pretty stable here with whoever's gone through. And here we are. We have about 50% community managers, about a quarter of you, a little more, are board members or owners, 12% attorneys, and 11% business partners. So a really nice spread there. And what we have is a lot of people, about 40% have electric vehicles in their community. Only 17% have electric vehicle chargers. And some people don't have any, 36%. And then 9% on solar panels. So very, very interesting. All right. Well, with that, we are going to go ahead and turn this over. Enough of me talking. We're going to turn this over to our esteemed panel. Jimmy, Sammy, and Will, take it away.
All right. Thanks, Alden. Thanks, everybody, for attending. Excited to be with you. It's been a labor of love here. Before starting the presentation, I want to acknowledge the contribution of a few people on my staff and outside my staff. Without Tracy Cryle's assistance, I think this presentation would have been much more difficult to achieve. She's my executive assistant. I also called in to help Lisa Sheffy, who was vice president of my property and casualty division. And we were lucky enough to have contribution of Kate Johnson, who is with Falcon Engineering, who answered some of the questions that Alden shared with us prior to this presentation. And they were generated from some curiosity and some prior presentation on this topic. Those questions fell in primarily three buckets. One, technical in nature, dealing primarily with the utility companies and the intrinsic requirement of some buildings. So we have some of those answers that's going to be posted later on in the chat, and Alden can share those with you. The second bucket is financial in nature, how much it's going to cost, who's going to pay for it, and how it's going to charge for it. And the last but not least is the charging etiquette, dealing with habitual offender and some of the challenges the association would be dealing with. So as we travel the journeys, this is some of the topic we wanted to address and cover. Very ambitious, as you can see, for the limited time that we have. Probably we have to speak fast to be very clear, but we may not cover every one of them to the extent some of these I need to be clarified a little bit more. Please feel free to reach out to any one of us. We have lots of content that we could not display, so there will be some handout that Alden will share with you, and then some material that we thought would be very critical to have. So in the chat, I posted three what I call very nice, well done reference points that you can avail yourself of. The first one, a Department of Transportation article that actually did a fantastic job in summing some of the stuff that we're going to mention and alerting you to some things ahead and showing you the beaten path. The second one is a Department of Energy article that actually outlines some of the issue that you will face, particularly dealing with utilities and things ahead, and some credit that your association members can take advantage of. And the last one is about risk management, what's coming down the pike as far as risk with these, both the vehicle side and the charging side. So feel free to open those up and read them. But as we travel through this presentation, some of those topics will be addressed. And so next slide, if you don't mind, Alvin. So we wanted to talk to you about the regulatory environment, and I'm going to hand it over to Will to talk to you about the, what's on the books now, what's gone down the pike, and I'm going to take it back for a second to talk to you about BPS. But Will, floor is yours.
Thank you, Sammy. Well, as you all know, the law is a wonderful factor in what goes on here. And in the community association world, we find that the law out there can sometimes help us with their associations, sometimes guide us, sometimes take over for us with regard to things. I look at the EV world a bit like we looked at satellite dishes in the old days. In the old days, satellite dishes were something that the governing documents could bar and no one could have satellite dishes. Then eventually the satellite industry got lobbyists and figured out that if we can't beat the associations in court, we can go to Congress and get them to pass laws that trump the association's documents and force the issue with regard to allowing them to be in place. A similar model has been followed by solar panels. So people are coming to terms with the fact that satellite dishes are a thing that are here that we can't block for the small dishes, a meter or less if it's on their property or on their controlled areas. Solar panels, similarly, it's hard to block them, or they're encouraged in a number of communities, notwithstanding what your documents say, or your documents have to be very clear to get in the way of them. EV is going the same way. So in terms of EV chargers, there's a clear recognition nationally that, and in many states, that there is a need to go green, that we need to reduce our carbon footprint, that electric is the way to go. We want to get off fossil fuels. That's an understanding that is not necessarily held by everybody in the world, but that the movement has grown and continues to grow. So that, as all of you know, by 2030, only electric cars are to be made in America. They've sold America as new vehicles. And the idea is to move us voluntarily or through market control toward that. The government's given a lot of money to help you buy EV cars, to encourage you to get that, because they're still not quote unquote cost effective relative to a gas model, but they're greener, they're better for the environment, and the government wants us overall to move in that direction. Many industries are there, and the impediment now, of course, is keep in mind that the move is from a national level, from a local level, and to get us going there. Community associations typically want to control these things, especially if they impact common areas or common elements, or impact your infrastructure, which we'll talk more about later. But the law is moving in a direction that an unfunded mandate that associations have to allow EV chargers on their property. And in some jurisdictions, they're pushing you to make them available. And other jurisdictions, they're taking a lighter touch and just saying, you can't stop someone from having them. They can have them like satellite dishes. We don't pay for those, but we have to allow them. And some are getting more proactive and saying, we're going to put in stations for the community and make them available to them because a number of our people are there, and it might improve marketability. But from a legal standpoint, the cave is coming in on us, and the move is definitely toward expanding the capacity to have EVs and EV chargers, and to get associations out of the way so that they cannot block them or stop them. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later today in terms of how they're doing that.
Yes, so next slide, Alvin. So in light of that, there are some, obviously, if you have a decision to make and you be considering this, one of the elements I wanted to bring to your attention, we want to discuss this, is the fact that lots of regulatory environment has been passed to force building performance and to make sure some of these building efficiency is paid attention to. So to the extent that you're going to start considering EV charging station, I think this is another element that you need to add to your bucket of to-do list, if you wish, and to make sure the benchmarking that you have, you'll see in this slide that there are some square footage and some deadlines, as well as, different states has passed, for instance, in Washington, D.C. area, both the Washington, D.C. and Montgomery County had already promulgated some of these benchmarking, some filing and whatnot, to the extent that the EV charging station is going to add a load to your building. It would be nice for you to consider that ahead of time and part of the planning incorporate that. The next couple of slides, again, alerting you to the fact that, hey, if you don't put proper planning, you may end up with a penalty, and that would be unnecessary if you plan ahead. One of the solutions that we see in this environment, that as you consider and talking about EV charging station, it may be wise to also consider solar panels being one of the solutions, to alleviate the pressure on the grid and provide some supplies, making your building green or comply with the efficiency scores that you're going to have, and also incorporating these capital investment together so your break-even point from a financial point of view can be reached a little bit earlier. Just a thought for you to consider, and as you go through the feasibility study and other things, and have all kind of consultant and engineer working with you. Next slide, Alvin. So this is where the different states that actually pass on these BPS standards. And so if you don't have them in your state, unfortunately, we're coming near you. It would be nice to have the clairvoyance to start planning ahead. And as you do one, you plan for the other as well. In addition to these guidelines and these performance standards, on the next slide, you'll see that Will is going to talk to you about, you cannot say no, like he mentioned a second ago. This is the solar panel idea, that if you were to install both solar panel and EV station, I think not only you would be helping the grid alleviate some of the pressure, but ultimately it could be a very, very good thing for your own association to alleviate the pressure from a financial point of view. On the next slide, I think we'll talk to you about Senate Bill number 4 and why and how would you deal with these restrictions, particularly if a one unit owner or 2 or 3 or 4 decided that they want to have their own charging station, their responsibility vis-a-vis of the association, and how would you deal with that? Well, back to you.
So in the old days, as I had mentioned before, we used to have the full authority with our governing documents to restrict things that we didn't want and control our own destiny. And things even as important as the First Amendment were secondary to our documents in terms of control, which is why we can say no to red doors. But with regard to EV chargers, the feds, and to go back for a quick second on the BPS, the feds are what they've done and what they encourage in terms of benchmarking for private property. They've also bought in December, the feds implemented BPS standards that apply to all federal buildings. So they're all in too. So it's all part of the green wave that is happening and looks like will certainly continue to happen. With regard to us, in terms of the charging stations, you know, we used to have complete control over our governing documents through what you could or couldn't do to change the common elements. And an owner couldn't just put up a charger because it's not something you put in your unit. It's something that you would put outside. It would mean wires going through the common elements, possible changes to the pavement of the parking areas. They clearly needed association approval and support. And a number of properties around here have people that have individual chargers in their condos, certainly in the townhomes and single family homes. Putting them on your own lot is not a big deal, not a problem. But the condos where the high concentration of people are in the cities are something that the government wants penetration on that. So the feds have decided with Senate Bill 4 that condo associations can't prohibit or restrict the installation or use of EV charging stations to an extent. So they're trumping your governing documents with regard to saying no, or not letting you use your architectural guideline control to bar or prohibit people from putting them in, to the extent that they don't create a safety concern or undue risk or burden, or it's just wholly impractical, so that it's not something that's doable. But if it's something that can be done, and there's a way to do it, and the owner pays for it, they're not pushing the cost on us, then the association cannot stand in their way, and that they do have the capacity to do that. Now, you can have reasonable restrictions, mercifully, so they can't just do anything they want in any way they want that's completely impractical or inconvenient for the association. You get the usual level of reasonable management of it to make it the best plan, not just any plan with regard to how they implement it. But you will need to work with them to make it happen. You can't dramatically increase their costs, and the manner in which you impose your restrictions, they need to be reasonable and fair. But the time has come where they are going to, if they're willing to pay for it, put them in. And of course, you can't drive up their cost of using the EV charging station, tax them effectively for using the station to reduce the performance. But a good idea with regard to allowing it and having it is trying to work it so that it is something that is sub-metered, so that, which does increase the cost, but it's fairer, so that they pay for the electricity and don't pass that through to the association, because making the association pay for their chargers is not what this law is about.
Real quick, Will, because we had a couple people ask the exact same thing, should be a quick answer. So this is current federal legislation on the books that applies to all HOAs and condos, correct?
Nationwide.
Nationwide. All right, there you have it.
Next slide, I guess, addresses the same topic, and I think, well, one of the questions.
The residents do pay for the installation. It's important to keep that in mind. It's not, the feds have not done an unfunded mandate where the association has to take on that cost. However, the association is capable and can and should, if they feel appropriate, especially if they're outdoors, install multiple charging stations in their public areas to make it less likely that people are going to want to install their own in the garage. So it's a big idea. It's a very good idea to make it available, and make it available at market rates, so it's not to make them unattractive. But you decide who's going to pay for it. The association has a lot of options, which we'll discuss a bit later, but the association has a lot of options as to how they're going to make the cost work in terms of is it a user-based thing? What's the charge going to be based on the amount of time that they use it? Who's going to, are they going to try to capture or recapture the cost of installation? Are they going to try to make it attractive to people outside the community to make it a money-making venture in some way, or at least to help spread the cost around? Do they or do they not want to allow people in, or do they want to keep people out and have systems in place that make it impossible for only the owners to use it? There are a lot of things to think about, which we'll talk some more about later, but there are issues there. There's also the need for upgrades. And one of the things that people that have been studying this have learned, and I know in my particular condominium, everybody can have a charger. They were way ahead of the curve. Anybody that wanted one, the association was all too willing to do it, and just charge the persons like $7,000 to set it up and run their own costs, and that was perfectly fine. But it got to the place where too many people were buying EVs in a hurry and putting in too many chargers, and they suddenly realized that the building didn't have the capacity to cover chargers for everybody, so they had to put a halt to individual charging stations and go and start looking at engineering to evaluate the property to see what their load capacity would be and what they would need to do to upgrade the property to be able to handle more charging stations on an individual basis or in terms of stations for the association more broadly. So those are things to think about and work through in terms of making that happen. But one of the upsides of the law that requires you to allow them to happen is they do not require you to have to go beyond what your building has the capacity to do, or what you have the capacity to afford, which is an upside. But so you give what you have, and you got to say yes to what the extent you can. But if you can't, then you don't have to. But most of the buildings are going to, as time goes by, as more and more vehicles are going to be electric, they're going to want to have the capacity to have enough electricity to allow for charging, especially after 2030, when all the cars are going to be, all the new cars are going to be electric. So you're going to want to look at that and figure out what the costs are going to be, start budgeting for and planning for that eventuality, instead of getting caught by the short hairs and getting burned on the later side. So weigh the funding options, figure out how you're going to make it happen. You can save for it, plan for it long term. If you're in a hurry, special assess for it, borrow to achieve it. There are a number of options available to you, but to think about and start thinking about the fact that the future is moving in that direction. And while it's been a slow takeoff thus far, it does seem to be the pace of acceptance is growing, and the desire to have charging capacity right where you live is increasing. So it is something to start planning for and thinking about. Next slide, please.
Yeah.
So,
Yes, I think this is one of the questions, Will, that came up also. If you were to open up the Pandora's box and let people install their own charging station, what are the responsibility? And I think this slide addresses exactly that.
Yes.
I think you touched on it, particularly if the unit owner moves, or if its tenant moves, they EV there anymore, could they reverse and take them equipment with them? And I think there was a couple of questions on that, Will, that you may want to address.
right. So, and absolutely, this, we are community associations. We do have authority to regulate what happens at our properties, especially when it affects the health and safety. Condos have greater authority and control than HOAs, but both have something to say about it. Look at what your authority is in terms of things. For example, at HOAs, you primarily have authority over the look and feel of a property on the lots, and then you have total control over the common areas. Health and safety is more of a concern in a condo on the common elements or the units, because whatever happens anywhere can affect everybody. And there are issues and certain concerns with having EV chargers and EVs on property, particularly indoors, which we'll talk a bit more about later. But you do want to make sure that you are planning and starting to think about adopting regulations and guidelines that make it clear that people that are going to be allowed to have chargers and that are going to install chargers, A, they're going to pay for it. Again, I keep hammering that home. B, when they pay for it, they're not going to get a shoddy job done by, cousin Elmo. They're going to get appropriate approvals, make sure that from the association to make sure they're in the right place with the least impact and the best look and feel and safety for the community. But they're also going to make sure that they are consistent with health and safety guidelines and zoning and code enforcement issues to make sure they're safe. You're going to want licensed installation and require that so that they can't just have anybody putting it together. You do not want a bad installation leading to a bad fire situation down the road. So making sure they're putting in appropriate installations with people that know what the heck they're doing, that are qualified, that are licensed to be able to do it, that pull the proper permits and get the appropriate government approvals and do it to code. All of those things are important for you to require them to do, and to make sure that they, when they get approval to do it on the association, that they vouch for the fact that they're going to do it correctly and follow your guidelines with regard to how it's going to be done, and check and follow up on them and get receipts from them to establish that they have indeed followed through on that to protect the community and protect yourselves. You want to make sure that you have an understanding and a login on what the charging stations are in the association, particularly in a condo, but even in an HOA, when they put them in their individual garages, you want to know what the impact is. You want to know where they're going to be, to the extent that properties are in HOAs with single family homes on 5-acre lots. It's less important because if they burn down their house, it's not going to affect anybody. But if you have townhouses, when you're next door to each other, you have a really hot electric fire that's caused in your one townhome, it could affect many townhomes. So or get to the community association facilities. So making sure they're aware and you're aware what they've got and where they've got, it's worth keeping a tally on. Obviously meeting health and building standards, making sure that they are properly coded and fire protected, and meet fire code in particular, is important. You want the electrical payments, the payment for the electricity on the owner. So in HOAs, it's real easy. It's going to be going to their electricity. They're definitely going to be paying for the cost of electricity. In condos and co-ops, it's going to be more challenging to do it, because you're going to need a sub-meter to enable yourselves to be able to make sure they pay for it if they have free-flowing EV chargers. If you have the EV charging systems that you get from outfits that have systems that keep track of everybody on a one-by-one basis, so that everybody pays to play, like going to the gas station, you pay for the gas that you use, or even the EV charging stations at places like Walmart, then you are individually paying for it. And that is an appropriate thing to do to make sure the beneficiary gets it. If it's an association common pool system, some people put them in as amenities, and they are protected so only owners or residents can get to them, but they don't charge for it. You're just encouraging people to have electric vehicles, and the whole property is covering the cost. And that's an altruistic but an efficient way to help be green, and it can be considered an amenity that can increase property values, much like the swimming pool. It's something that's nice and good to have. Not everybody uses it, but people that do use it drive up property values overall for your community. So that is an approach that some are taking. Others are taking the approach, they're making sure that, well, if you have this system there, how long are you going to let people use it? How are you going to bump them off? So you're going to need to think about and plan for how long you're going to want people to use it, what type of system you have as to how long they need to use it to get an appropriate charge level. If they come in and they leave it on for too long, having a penal system to make them pay more for the time they go beyond what you've established as the appropriate level of time that you've got. So that you've got, say, they get 2 hours and they stay there 3, that first 2 hours are at market rate, but the third hour might be double the charge to make them wish they'd gotten up in 2 hours, and make sure they do it right the next time. Or if you have people that come in and hog it and stay overnight, you may charge them hour by hour to make it really punishing for them to take it beyond the time that's appropriate. So setting up etiquette, setting up systems, making sure people know how to get a hold of people that are on there, so they can call and say, hey, you're tying us up, I want to get on. So they'll come and move it and work with etiquette in that regard. All are good practices and thoughts for setting up your regulations, thinking through and planning ahead as to how you can encourage appropriate conduct, and be flexible with regard to changes that you might see, depending on the type of neighbors and people that you have in your community, as to you need the more restrictive, more Machiavellian approaches to address them, or if you can go with a lighter touch and you can use simple guidelines instead of hard and rigid fast rules. Depends on who you've got there, but you're going to want to address that to make sure that you get fair usage of it, so that you encourage usage of it and don't discourage usage to the place where you've got this wonderful equipment that nobody uses, but it's cheaper for them to go to Walmart instead of using yours. You want to consider those things to make sure that you're getting value for it and that you're making it work effectively for the community that you've got. And then insurance, of course, is important, and that turn over to Sammy to talk about that.
Yeah, so Will, this is an area that actually a little bit most of the association think about these things and implement things, and this is the last thing to think about. This is one of the area that you need to think about first. To the extent that a unit owner decides to have their own charging station, it's imperative that they provide you with enough coverage and proof of coverage via COI. I think there was a couple of questions in the chat about, so what kind of coverage, what's the limit? So those are elements that need to be part and parcel of the conversation. I think the limit should be at least $1 million worth of liability and endorsing the association as an additional insured, not additional interest. All the indicators right now, and we're going to share with you in a minute about the risk of possible fire and things, or tripping, or some other challenges that these particular vehicle pose to the association, all leads to the fact that yes, you can have your own, but no, in case of an event, we need to make sure the association is well protected, and there would be a subrogation between the association master policy and the insured carriers. On the next couple of slides, these are also an issue that's going to be addressed both in terms of dollars and cents. There will be an impact on the association overall for risk and exposure that you need to account for. But for now, for this early on in the stage of the conversation, the most important thing that, in addition to what Will had mentioned to you, to pay attention to the government document, is to incorporate in the requirement for transfer of risk and making sure the association is made whole in the event of a fire or basically badly using or vandalizing that unit. The association has to have coverage to cover the common element, but the unit owner had to provide coverage showing liability and property to the extent that necessary. We think $1 million could be, possible in, initial level. It could be higher than that. It's the density is higher, or if it's a different kind of charging station that you decided to install, which we're going to talk about level 1, level 2, or level 3. So with that said, I guess we covered a little bit of a ground about whetting the appetite to the fact that A, this is a very, very important issue you got to pay attention to. B, it requires some planning, and some planning both in terms of legality, talking to your attorney, talking to the utility, talking to some engineers, talking to your insurance agent. And unfortunately, in the case of an insurance agent, we are the last people to hear about this issue until an issue happens. So make very sure that from the early stage of planning, you inquire about any supplemental application you need to fill out. And God knows, lots of carriers are paying attention to this. Some of them not even willing to provide an extent coverage. So be careful with that. But to the extent they do, they want to know about the risk and the number of station, the cost, and who's installing them. Exactly the information well mentioned. They need exactly the same, practically the same information. But they also may ask you to provide proof that the contractor who did the work not only qualified, but also have adequate coverage in the event that malfunction happened after the installation. Next slide.
Hey,
So if we did not convince you, and I'm going to have Jimmy talk a couple of minutes about what he's seen in his association, if you're not convinced that this is an issue that you have to pay attention to, just look at the statistics. And this is 22. By the way, in 23 it's even more. You see 40 folds in growth in EV vehicles sold. And Tesla just published their results for the second quarter, and they blew the production by 18%. So there are lots of needs and a tremendous amount of response from the public to actually move from combustion system to electrifying their transportation. So we thought this would be a very interesting slide to mention to you. So even if you didn't pay attention to you or you're resistant, I think whether you want it or not, it's coming your way. Next slide. So this is the public charging stations nationwide. The graph says it all, but on the next slide, we're going to show you the exactly, put a little bit of a microscope on this. So the level of level 1, level 2, and level 3, Jimmy will tell you about a little bit of nomenclature. So when we talk about these, you know exactly what we're talking about, but in a nutshell, level 3 is the most desired. And Jimmy, take it from there.
Sure. If it's okay, I had trouble with my Wi-Fi. If you could go back to the consumer payment solution slide first. Yeah, great. So basically, these charging stations can be programmed to meet an association's needs. For example, the pay stations we have here are programmed so that the first 3 hours are a certain rate. After 3 hours, the rate goes up. And then if someone stays in the space too long, they're going to be charged a penalty. It's really important to understand that, this may not be a money-making adventure because you really have to set the programming to market rate. Otherwise, the owners or users are going to go outside and find cheaper places to charge their cars, or in some cases even charge their cars for free. So if you can move to the next slide. So in your decision making, it's really important to understand the different levels of charging stations, right? Level 1 is a 120 outlet, just a regular outlet that you have at home that's converted into a socket that plugs into your car. It's not efficient, but it is useful, and it's something to keep in mind. For example, in our pay parking garage, when we didn't have charging stations, a lot of people were charging outside of this area and then coming into the garage and then plugging into the 120 to top off. So it can be useful, and it's important to keep in mind. One of the things you have to be careful of is not to add an extension cord to the charging cord, because they can overheat and either flip the breaker or even potentially catch on fire. Level 2 operates on 240, and you can charge after 2 to 4 hours 80% capacity of your batteries in a car. It is the most popular. It's the level 2 is what we have in our pay garage. We have 2 stations there. I think that it's something that people also will install in their homes, and it's just probably the most common one. And part of the reason is that it doesn't require as much infrastructure as a level 3. In our case, the garage hired a vendor. The vendor came in, was able to tap directly into a breaker box that we had and run conduit to the parking space and set up 2 level 2 chargers. Level 3 charging needs more infrastructure. It's DC power, DC current. It is a fast charge. Most people are using level 3s to travel. So people go across the country. They're just literally going from one level 3 charger to another level 3 charger. I think that some communities may consider a mix. Maybe 1 level 3 charger and 2 level 2 chargers. It all depends what the demands are on your community.
And Jim, that's an excellent summary. So on the next slide, you will see that if you take an inventory of all the public charging stations in the country, this is what you'll find. About 130,000 of them are connectors, but out of those connectors, like Jimmy mentioned, the level 3 of them is only 28,000 of them. So think about 28,000 fast charging for 10 million vehicles. So you can tell from this slide that we have a little bit of an imbalance here. And what that says is the best place to eat is home. The best place to charge your vehicle most likely would be at home in the near future, even though we're experiencing lots of public charging right now for free. Like Jimmy was mentioning to me that lots of his constituents and owners go and charge either in parking lots or grocery stores or things like that. But this slide will tell you that the public charging stations are not really nearly an option. There was a study done in California about a year ago, looking at all the public stations and surveying them. They found at any one time about 25% of those charging stations are down due to vandalism users errors, software updates, or literally the station itself is a malfunction due to water damage or some other things. So bottom line is, if you as a association members and managers, you will be part of the solution providing capacity for these vehicles to be charged. Otherwise, we'll have lots of vehicles on the side of the roads and some issues. No, next slide, Alvin. Again, talking about, as you consider this, the positive side to the negative, I think Will touched on this, Jimmy touched on this as well. There are lots of positive, and whether you're convinced that are positive or not, unfortunately, we have to deal with this issue and mostly focus on the next slide, which is some of the challenges you will face as you move forward. So I'm going to touch on a couple of these, and I'm going to bring Jimmy to talk about the experience he has with his community. But what we see, again, I want to emphasize a little bit selfishly that, unfortunately for us on the insurance field, we are the last people to hear about a station being installed, particularly if there is a claim or some issue between a user, a unit owner, or a visitor. So please make sure you discuss things with your agent, lay it ahead and plan ahead. The second thing that we got feedback from different consultant firms and engineering firm that most likely you have to involve your fire department and also an electrical engineer to study the capacity and your current installation to make sure you know what you got and what you don't. So those are a couple of things, couple of nuggets that we've seen. More to come in the next couple of slides. But Jimmy, you had a couple of words of wisdom on this, the need, the feasibility, and also
the big question that everyone has when they're considering installing charging stations is, how many do we need? And the first place to start is doing a survey of your community and trying to really pinpoint the demand. The tricky part is you really need to look deep into that survey. I'll give you a good example. We have 450 spaces, pay spaces down in our garage, lots of monthly pass holders that have EV cars, and they really pressured the garage into setting up charging stations. And I recently spoke to one of the owners of the garage, and he basically told me that all the charging stations in these pay garages on the East Coast, they own hundreds of them on the East Coast, that they're not using the chargers as much as they expected or as much as the demand appeared to be. One of the things that I experienced this past weekend, I went to Georgetown in Washington, D.C. It was a beautiful day. Went into this really huge underground garage, packed with EV cars. There were 5 level 3 chargers sitting empty. So it's really important to kind of figure out, what your actual demand is. And of course, it may be the case that, it might be mandated so that you have 3 charging stations. So you may not have a choice but to start with 3 charging stations. I think the best way to go and the best approach is to start off with 2 charging stations and then make sure that you build your infrastructure in a way that you can easily add additional if needed, and really also consider whether you want to do a mix or not, having 1 level 3 and maybe 2 level 2 stations. But again, that's going to also be determined by your facility and if it can easily accommodate the charging stations.
Jimmy, there was a couple of questions asked before, and I think in the chat I saw passingly that there was also some concern. Level 3 charging station consume a lot more power than the other 2 levels. And so the demand on the grid obviously is going to be more. The demand, you may need to also accommodate some wiring and whatnot. And this hand in hand with that solution we told you early on, to the extent all these would be mandated and every one of these association needs to install level 3, and may put lots of pressure on the grid. And solar energy could be a possible solution for that. And then as you examine this, you can examine the other one as well. On the next slide, Jimmy,
I
you're
think
gonna talk about,
yeah, have a
how to
large,
approach that.
yeah, I think if you have a large area like that, big parking facility outside, one of the things you might want to consider as time goes on is, adding solar panels. And what they have now is canopy systems, which, they're above ground. So cars would park under the solar panel structure. And then, of course, you'd have your charging stations. And another big thing that's coming along is, storage batteries. So if you live in a state where you might have rolling blackouts for whatever reason, or problems with the electrical grid, then you can consider some of these other supporting infrastructure that will keep these cars charged.
So briefly, Jimmy, on the approach, I think we talked about possibly the association doing it themselves or hiring someone to help them or having a one-stop shop or all of that. For the shortness of time, mentioned that very quickly on these.
Sure. I mean, you can go out alone and purchase a system by yourself and hire a qualified installer, or you can yourself go out and start talking to vendors. A lot of people are utilizing consultants, and consultants kind of work similar to what how solar panels work, where the charging stations would end up like paying the consultant, but in some cases you can pay the consultant directly, so you don't have a conflict of interest. You can also go with a one-stop shop. They're going to do the research and kind of figure out what your demand might be. They're going to inspect your property's infrastructure. They're going to design the system. They're going to send out an RFP and work up permitting and then monitor the build out. While one of the benefits of going with an engineer is that, of course, they can, answer all your questions and satisfy your concerns to minimize liability and keep the project safe. Homeowners that have, like associations that have single family homes, should really consider working up some kind of guideline for installation. I think that's really important. And it's important that it's done by an engineering firm. And of course, it'd be great if you had 2 or 3 vendors that the community would only use. That way you can kind of control the installation and then prevent any type of fires or other concerns.
Talking about fires and concerns. So this is in the next slide, and the next actually 2 or 3 slides, we'll talk about that. So Alden, make sure to keep us on track. So on the procurement process, as a matter of fact, the carrier, when you alert them to the fact that you do have EV or solar, one of the main thing in the application, and they will ask you who installed that, are they qualified, what kind of track record they have, and if you have any secured any certificate of insurance from that contractor. Thus, your best friend in this area, it will be your legal counsel, and will and has an our past interaction with different managers. This is an area where also is not paid attention to until too late. When you hire and when you look at the contract for that particular organization to install these things for you, or an engineer to give you advice, it's critical to check their professional insurance liability and to check their CUI to make sure they have adequate coverage. We'll touch on that to make sure the association is well served on the front end instead of after the fire trying to find a hose and put it out.
No, absolutely. As we say with regard to all contracts that the association goes into, it pays very, very much to first make sure you find somebody that's qualified to do the work and that has a good reputation in the field, but then making sure that you don't just sign their proposal, but have your counsel look at the agreement and make sure it's got the protections for the association so that they've got insurance, that they'll name you as additional insured, that they have the capacity to know what the laws is and the requirements are, and we'll follow them and apply them, and we'll do it in accordance with all applicable laws and codes to make sure that they have identification. Cross identification is fine, but making sure that you get them to identify and of course have insurance to back that up. Those are all things you're going to want to do. You also want to look into getting insurance to cover them, bonding insurance, to make sure that they fail to get the job done, that you'll have insurance there to cover having somebody else come in and finish the job. so they won't leave you hanging with a partially installed product. So there's a lot to do with regard to the contract language to protect yourselves, not to just in any way screw over the EV installer, but to make sure that it's a fair and equitable, responsible job. And since EV chargers, it's not a put it in and it's over situation, there's ongoing maintenance that needs to be done and warranties that you might want to have to make sure that if you own it, that's taken care of. And if you're leasing it, that they will address the concerns in a timely fashion so as not to leave your people stranded and inconvenienced with a system that's down and doesn't get put back up for 2, 3, 4 weeks, which you can imagine will cause some great angst for people that depend on it for getting to and from work. So you're going to want to build all of that into your contracts to make sure you're protecting your association.
Yeah, so Will, and that's before even you put the project in motion and get it. So again, bonding is something very obscure and very sometimes nobody pays attention to, unless there is a financial institution funding this. We see any project over $500,000 would be very smart and wise to seek a bond from performance bond from that contractors to make sure well-financed, well-funded institutions, A, vets the contractor, B, will be there in case the contract is not fulfilled to its letters of the way the contract has been signed. The next couple of slides, we want to obviously bring to your attention some of the obvious risks of EV in general, batteries. So I think the next couple of slides, go ahead, Aldo, on the next slide too. We want to talk about maintaining these equipment is also requires certain attention to detail and things like that. And you may need to have a contractor that comes and does this to make sure that the lifespan of that equipment is well maintained, and that's going to cost money. And that's going to be part of your financial analysis to make sure to defray the cost as the user, the end user, hook up and start using it, as well as, peak hours. If the utility company basically charge you extra cost for that, it's passed on to the consumer as well. So that the association is made whole. JB mentioned to you, you have to have a decision whether you want to make money or you want to provide it as an amenity or you want to be breaking even. So all that is part and parcel of this particular issue. But maintenance is the last thing think about. And I think your consultant should probably determine some price per kilowatt that's been used to know exactly how much your charge would be. Next slide, Alden. So these are some of the exposure that we've seen. So what's missing in here is one element that was brought to my attention by the underwriter this morning is the fact that EV station would be prone in the future to cyber attack and cyber hacking. So this is an area where association in general never paid attention to, but I think this will bring it to the forefront because these EV stations may be monitored, maybe on the web, and by the virtue of somebody using them, putting their credit card information in there and everything else, cyber becomes extremely important. And so you want to make sure you load up, or at least that there is some exposure, and talk to your agent about getting some coverage. Some of these issues are being studied and remedied, whether that thermal runaway or some other things, but these things you may not be able to control. A thermal runaway, that's unfortunately, if it does happen, you just need to make sure that the fire department is close enough and did some analysis and you have some prevention in place. However, cable being loose, standing water where the thing is in there, an extension cord that Jimmy mentioned a second ago, all these things, making sure you have camera and protecting the things, making sure some signage to make absolutely certain that people are aware of what's there surrounding and to be careful about that. All those goes part and parcel of having a very adequate coverage and the carrier being able to provide you with the coverage at reasonable cost, but also to prevent claims. We don't want claims to happen. We don't want those issues. In the event they do happen, you need to have a certificate to lean on. If the person charging their station is properly covered and misuse the facility, I think you would have a recourse and your carrier can also subrogate. Next slide. Again, emphasizing some of the risk exposure and making sure before the installation, during the installation, after the installation, every one of those, they have proper coverage that need to be put in place. I mentioned to you a second ago, before installation, you may ask the contractor to provide you with surety bond. there is also builder's risk that you need to acquire, particularly if it's very expensive supplies that's been put and stored in your facility and there was theft. That's the only way for you to be insured for that, because your coverage would not be, because it's a project that you can put in place. Some of these may be technical terms, and the time and limitation is not enough for us to talk about, but please remember, before you put shovel to the ground and install these, there are some insurance requirement and transfer of risk that you need to do during, similarly, and after the installation is done, some warranty from the contractors, as well as adding that to your own policy to account for the cost of the replacement cost of these facilities, but also the liability in case something happened. So best friend beside Will is your own agent who is dealing with you, making sure they know what you're doing. Next slide. Again, this is part of that signage is proof in the event of a claim. Obviously, if you have 1 or 2 claims after this, you most likely you're going to get a letter from the carrier saying, we appreciate doing business with you, but on the next renewal, you got to go look for another carrier. So the fact that you have some risk management in place and show them proof that you've done everything you know how to prevent a claim or future claim from happening could be extremely helpful for your agent to secure coverage. Next slide. Premium impact. So you definitely unequivocally will have a premium impact, obviously, from just the value of what you have been installed that need to be added to the property, because some of these equipment are anchored to the ground. So factor in how much it's going to cost you, both in terms of premium for the liability, as well as the unit owners. They themselves need to be appropriately covered. One thing overlooked all the time is the individual unit owner coverage, the HO6. You want to make sure to educate them. Will and I talked about this many, many times. It really helped immensely if the unit owner is properly prepared, they know about the risk, and they get their own coverage in the event of a large claim. While subrogation may not take place between the two carriers, it's just by itself. It's a very good preventer of risk and making sure alerting them to that fact. So educating your own unit owner, their tenant and guest would be very, very important. Next slide. Yeah, so take it back to Will, the carrot and the stick and the etiquette. So I think, Will, you covered this, but maybe a little bit more about, yes, we have a wonderful facility that everybody can use and communicating to them via email and different things. But in case they don't, and usually about 1 or 2 habitual offenders will spoil the pot for everybody else, what to do.
Absolutely. Everybody plays better when they have a clear understanding of what the rules are. So it's really important to first think about what the rules should be, what will work, and engaging people that are going to be stakeholders in the process. Developing the rules is always a good idea. The board, the committee, opening up to the owners, surveying them, getting a sense of who's going to want to play, who's going to want to use it, how they would like to use it. Then formulate your rules and make it really, really clear what the hours of usage are, what the pricing is going to be, how the pricing will change over the course of time. Impressing upon them the need to remember that this is for everybody. If you have community usage, and what a lot of you will have instead of individual chargers, so making sure it's clear what the practice is going to be, whether you will or won't allow guests to use them, or if it's just for residents to use them. Think it through. People do have guests. They do come in electric cars. It may want to be something you allow to happen. What the charging protocol will be. Do you have better or pricing for residents than for guests, if you have room for guests at all? That's all going to be important. And then think about how you're going to enforce the rules that you do put in place. You've got your standard enforcement procedures. You may, the technology around the equipment may make it easier to keep track of who's using it by whatever system you have to allow them to gain access. But if you don't have one, consider having one. And even if it means just being as simple as putting in cameras so that you can see who's using it when and how long they're there. But do take the steps that you need to be able to effectively enforce and not make anybody think that they can get away with just anything they want, and also make it clear that it's not going to be some level of you're picking on somebody with selective enforcement, but that you're uniform and consistent in the manner in which you enforce, so that you get the sense of integrity. Everybody knows they're going to follow the same rules. Everybody knows that you're not going to let them get away with a ton, so that they don't abuse it. And you cut down the chances for very nasty interpersonal disputes. But having a good setting a good tone, educating reminding people with regard to what the rules of the road are, all things that are important to helping to have an effective system with this, like any other resource that's not available to everybody all the time, but that you want to have it used equitably is important.
Yeah, so well, one thing I recently actually received a question from one of the clients asking that a neighboring association would like to access the EV charging station in this facility, and they're willing to sign a contract to allow their unit owner and guest. And what would that impact be on their insurance policy? Once we contacted the carrier was not happy with that at all. They frowned upon that quite a bit. Even with the contract and a certificate, sometimes it's difficult. So make very sure that, you know, you try to be a good Samaritan, maybe provide some additional help that over the long run, that could be problematic, particularly in case of a claim. With that said, I think we exceeded the time allowed by a couple of minutes. So Alden, back to you. Let us know how did we do and how can we look ahead into what's going to happen in the future.
All right, excellent. We
Any
do have
questions?
some questions here. Just wanted to, so we'll go ahead and move forward here. All right. So first off, the question that we have, and I understand if anyone has to leave, that you can disconnect at this point if you would like. We are going to continue on with the Q&A. If you missed it, it will be part of the recording, which will be available by Friday at the absolute latest. First question here says, Pennsylvania law doesn't permit allocation of common element space to unit owners unless right is reserved in documents. This is posing an issue with allowing unit owners to install their own charger where the parking spaces are a common element. Do you have any suggestions for them?
So with regard to the bar on allocating it for anybody individually, if you can find a way to do it for the community, making it an amenity that's available to everybody, that can be a good workaround. And if there is, if you're allowed to do that, and you're also allowed to charge by use, so that it's a common element available to all owners, but whoever uses it is paying a fee for it, then at the initial point, the person that wants to use it is the only one with an EV, they end up paying up all the costs with the association to the use of it. I think you can comply with Pennsylvania law and get it achieved at the same time. But it does look like you might be precluded. Although there is the question as to whether or not the national law is going to trump the Pennsylvania law so as to actually enable them to have that, the association to grant them that use. And I haven't had a chance to look at that because we don't have a similar law. All of the laws in our jurisdictions are you can have them, and that they trump your documents. In Maryland and DC, the state and district laws trump the governing documents. And in Virginia, if it's in the declaration that you can say no, then you can still say no. But if it's not in the declaration, you can say yes. So we have more flexibility than you do in Pennsylvania, but I think that's a possible workaround. If you want to work around, if you don't want to work around, you can hold steady on the Pennsylvania law until somebody gets in court to say otherwise.
Excellent. Next question here. What about a condo owner installing a level 1 charger in their garage? What steps does the board need to take to ensure compliance?
I think it's irrespective of the level of the charger, I think that it's important. I mean, obviously level 1's got the lowest concern because it's just a regular output, but they certainly are still going to want to develop an application procedure and checklist and verify that they're using qualified electrician, that it's, meets code, that they're not doing anything that's going to cause any increase in insurance. If they're going to use a qualified person to put it in, those things you want to go through the checklist, make them show the receipts that they're doing that, and that should get you home.
One person says, I have residents with EV chargers in their deeded parking spaces in the garage. I have concerns from other residents concerning spontaneous fires. They were all installed properly, but how do I address that concern of non-EV residents?
So with regard to the general concern, obviously if they've been inspected and they look like they're fine, I think we've all heard about EV fires. I think that the general, I have also heard that there are more gas engine fires than EV fires, but the EV fires burn really, really hot, which is a problem. And so there is naturally going to be concern in that regard. I think that it tends to be a problem that's that goes around defective equipment. So, and typically defective batteries, not chargers, that are what gives cause to the problem. So having, if they're going to want to get into the weeds and get into some methodology involving inspections and verifications of the good condition of the battery systems and batteries in the vehicles, and having them verify that would probably help. I don't know anybody that's actually doing that. That's relatively intrusive, but that may be what you really need to do to have
Load up on insurance.
Well, you definitely want to make sure you have insurance if you can get insurance, and make sure they have insurance. And I think I saw somebody ask a question with regard to whether or not the insurance that a homeowner can get can be made to cover the damages to the association. And I do picture the scenario of a garage fire with an EV burning down a building. And I can't imagine anybody can get enough insurance on an HO6 to cover a building. So the association's policy is definitely going to have to kick in. So the association needs to make sure that their coverage will cover a casualty that evolves from an EV charger in their building, whether it's an association charger or a unit owner's charger, to protect the building overall, as well as making sure that you do what you need to do in terms of making sure the property is physically outfitted appropriately. I understand, for example, that DC, if you have EV chargers, is coming up with regs that say that you have to have 4 sprinklers over chargers anywhere that there are chargers in the garage, to help you have a better chance of suppressing a fire that flows from that. So that's a substantial increase over the normal load of sprinkler heads required in a building.
And Will, to your point, I think one of the stakeholders that need to be consulted is the fire department to make sure accessibility in the event of a fire, some other guidelines and some other things that the association can do while procuring the services and planning ahead. So we found that, again, that's lost people to be called, and bringing them in the forefront could be extremely helpful to show where the location should be and how would they deal with that. I need to mention that lots of research is being conducted in this space to contain that fire. So right now it's kind of a little bit scary when you look at some of these, the intensity of the fire, how much impact it has, and how the fire department dealing with them. But my staff gave me an article just this morning that there are some tremendous research that's being done and some progress in that vein. So who knows, maybe in a year or so we'll have some new methodology about how to put out the fires. But for now, the blanket and letting that thing burn out is the best thing that they came up with. Back to you, Alden.
Yeah, so it sounds like we kind of at least touched on and probably answered some of Jessica's question about fires and explosions due to EV stations and vehicles, since they can affect the structure of the building. Would the owner's liability be enough to cover? Sounds like the answer to that is no. And the follow-up to that was can you provide some HO6 carriers that would be willing to list the association as an additional insured?
Yeah, so this is a chronic problem. So there are some carrier that reluctant to add the association as an additional insured. They prefer to have an additional interest. Having said that, though, your agent can do a much better job to explain to the underwriter or to whoever is providing that to the necessity per contract, particularly if will help you or your legal counsel help you embed in your rule governing document. This is one of the things that's required. We did find some carrier that, despite all those attempts, they're still reluctant because in the past have been dragged into many other claims that they think they should not be facing. The interface between the HO6 and the master depends on the jurisdiction you're in, but also depends on the government document as well. But the mere fact of bringing to the forefront to the unit owner by itself accomplishes an awareness and the fact that they have a skin in the game, they need to protect themselves. Remember, there is no, if the HO6 doesn't cover, the association still come after the unit owner or the guest or the tenant to make them whole, particularly if they, through their negligence or their vehicle, have caused tremendous damage. So it behooves them to have coverage to at least alleviate some of that risk. Back to you, Albert.
All right. We did have another question about what if in a condo we'll get all the fire ones out here. If somebody installs a charger in their garage, is there legal protection for the association if the vehicle causes a fire?
So if they are allowed to install the charger, and if the charger was fine and the car was fine to the best of everybody's knowledge, and they're not negligent with regard to it, there's not strict liability with regard to having chargers or electric vehicles. So in terms of liability protection, certainly if you allow somebody to have a charger and you put together an agreement and they agree to indemnify the association and to obtain insurance to cover that indemnification, if you can get that, then that could provide some level of help for you. Otherwise, you're going to have to establish that they were negligent in some way, i.e. that they knew that their equipment was defective and didn't fix it in a timely fashion, and that's what gave rise to it. Then their insurance would probably cover them to a decent extent with regard to it. Either potentially their automobile or maybe their HO6 might provide some coverage. Otherwise, their bank account might be providing some coverage for it, but probably only, as with most documents, up to the extent that the association's insurance doesn't cover it. Because most documents say that owners are responsible for damage that's caused by their negligence to the extent not covered by the association's insurance. And the association's insurance covers the whole building in most jurisdictions. So, effectively, they'd be responsible for the deductible if it doesn't go over the association's policy. But if it goes beyond the association's insurance, you look back to them beyond that. They can have some exposure. But if you get the agreement signed up front that they identify us, that gives you a better chance of making the argument if your documents don't already say it. There's also amending your documents to impute that liability. And that's something that you could probably pass now. Like, fewer people own electric vehicles than people that don't. And they might be all too willing to amend their documents to give you the capacity to have heightened level of protections from the EV owners in the early days, at least, before they outnumber the gas owners.
All right. We have one question about the allowing if installing a charger requires utility company to work to accommodate load capacity, can the HOA just decide not to do the upgrade? And therefore you can't do it because it's not possible because we're not doing this upgrade, or would they be forced to upgrade in case?
Yeah, no, they can't do it. They can't do it. That's their upside. If they can't do it, or they can do it, but they can't afford to do it, then they can still say no. They don't have the capacity.
One question is, how do you find a good consultant or engineer? Maybe Jimmy can help out with that one.
Sure. Yeah, there's so many out there on the market. I guess I can mention one of them is Falcon Group is one of them, and they work on the East Coast, and I think they have offices throughout the country. But one of the places you can go to is an engineering firm, and a lot of times you can ask them and they can kind of guide you in a direction because they're all kind of interconnected. So if you work with an engineering firm, even mechanical ones, they can probably guide you on other engineering firms that just deal with this.
Yeah, and so one word on that, Alden, as well, as you vet these vendors, just make very sure you have a certificate of insurance from them, making sure that the edge is an additional insured and they have adequate coverage. That information is going to come in play when you apply for your own carrier, because they're going to ask you for that information to make sure the equipment installed properly and they have a recourse in an event that things didn't go well.
And we'll just do one last one here. If you enter into a profit share type of agreement, what would be the recommended length of time on the agreement? We have one vendor that wants a 30-year agreement, for example.
Yeah, I would say that's a little too long. I mean, a lot of, there's a lot of companies out there that'll, lease the equipment to you or do a lease purchase agreement. I think all of it's negotiable. And, 30 years just, sounds a little excessive. And so you may need to find another vendor that will be a little more accommodating or will fit your needs. But I think, a 6 to 7 year lease purchase agreement is more common.
This technology is evolving very fast. So who knows, in about 5 years, everything would be obsolete and some more charging station, more efficient, different other things can happen. So, yeah, Jimmy, great point.
Excellent. Well, I think with that, we are going to go ahead and call this to a close. Thank you for those that have stayed on with us. That have gone through there. So I just need to do a couple of things and then we're going to go away. Registration for this live webinar entitles you to access to the recording archive after the webinar is finished. Please note that the recorded archive will be available within 48 hours of today's event. Just return to the same login page at a later date, log in, and you can view the archive over the next 120 days. If you're planning on using this program for continuing education credits for your CAI credentials, you can print out a certificate now or at any later point in time. To access your certificate of completion, you must first complete the webinar evaluation. Your comments or suggestions are very important to us to help us provide you with this kind of quality program. The evaluation is going to be, if you've accessed us through caionline.org and through My Online Learning, if you just look over there, webinar evaluation is going to be right there. If you just joined us from the email, log into caionline.org, go and click into My Online Learning, launch the class, and you should be able to see it. Thank you so much to Will Washington, Sammy Satori, and Jimmy Suisa for this fabulous program. Thank you for participating. Incredible questions and just incredible people you can just see in the chat. There are incredible people in there, some webinar speakers in the chat, just all sorts of wisdom all throughout. So thank you all, and we hope to see you here again soon. Today's program is copyright by 2023 Community Associates Institute with all rights reserved. That concludes today's program. Thank you. You may all disconnect now. Thanks to all of you guys.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.